"Let him die! He ain't one of us!" The words floated sharp through the heat, just as the last of the sunlight caught on the rim of the town's only well. Dustwell, Arizona Territory, August 1882. No one moved. Dust curled up from the road in lazy spirals, drifting across warped porches and through the cracks of dry plank doors. The town was no more than a scatter of stubborn buildings, a tilted church with missing shingles, a one-room schoolhouse rarely used, and the courthouse, if it could be called that, a squat adobe box with flaking whitewash and a rusted bell that hadn't rung in years. And yet, in that moment, with the sun dragging its last breath behind the ridgeline, Dustwell held its breath, like it mattered. A man lay slumped beside the well. Older, skin dark and cracked like weathered leather, one arm limp, the other wrapped in a blood-crusted cloth. Apache by the beadwork at his collar. His head lolled toward the dust, eyes closed, mouth dry as stone. A tin cup lay just out of reach. 6 townsfolk stood near, forming a crooked half-circle, arms crossed, hats low, expressions unreadable. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke again. But their silence said it all. He didn't belong here, and so he could die. Inside the courthouse, Judge Caleb Whitaker stood still. The window was cracked open, just enough to let in the smell of hot dirt and the sound of that voice. Let him die. He closed the ledger slowly. No gavel, no law today. Just the ache in his right leg, from a war that hadn't ended for him even after the surrender, and the sound of silence masquerading as decency. He took his time crossing the room. His boots made no sound on the dirt-packed floor. The pistol on the desk stayed untouched. The door opened with a creak. The light from outside flared briefly across the faded plank walls, catching the edge of a faded photograph pinned behind his chair. His wife and son, long gone now. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Heat still hung low, rippling above the dirt. The townsfolk glanced his way, then looked away just as quickly. Then he saw her. A young woman, barefoot, dress torn at the hem, dust clinging to her calves like soot. She was crouched beside the dying man, not touching him, but kneeling steady. One hand held the tin cup. The other rested against the well's stone lip for balance. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for help. She simply tipped the cup toward his lips, again and again, as if the water itself could change the mind of death. Her hair clung damp to her temples, strands stuck with sweat and wind. Her shoulders were burned, dress split slightly at one side, pinned together with a rusted piece of wire. And still, she was calm, not ashamed, not pleading, just there. Caleb took one slow step down. None of the others moved. He looked at the girl, then at the man, then back at the well, and then he spoke, low and even. Get him into the shade. It wasn't a request. There was a pause, brief but deep, like the earth itself held its breath. Then the girl nodded. Caleb bent beside the man without groaning or sigh. His body protested, but he ignored it. The woman moved with him. Together they lifted the elder, light as driftwood, fever burning off his skin, and carried him toward the adobe building. Inside, the dust shimmered in the lamplight. The door closed behind them. And outside, the people of Dustwell went back to pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. The courthouse was cooler inside, but not by much. The walls, thick with years of layered clay and sand, held the heat like memory. Caleb moved to clear the bench with the worn wool blanket draped over one end. He swept aside case slips and a cracked ledger with one arm, not caring where they fell. The woman helped lower the old man onto the bench. Her movements were careful, practiced, but not delicate. She didn't flinch at the blood or the smell or the rasp of his breathing. She dipped a cloth into the water bucket at the back of the room, wrung it with firm hands, and began to clean the wound at the man's shoulder. Caleb watched from the doorway. His arms folded loosely, but his eyes were alert. She hadn't spoken since they entered. Neither had he. Finally, after she pressed the cloth gently along the elder's brow, he broke the silence. "You a nurse?" She didn't look up. "No." Another silence passed, this one thicker. "I worked with a woman who was, during the war. She took me in." That was all she said. That was all she gave. He nodded once, as if that was enough. "You got a name?" The woman paused, a beat longer than needed. Then, "Mara. Mara Ellis." Caleb nodded again. "Caleb Whitaker." He didn't offer his hand. She didn't expect him to. "I know who you are," she said quietly, not looking up. That stopped him. She dipped the cloth again, continued cleaning. "You touch him only to move him into shade and give water," she said, her voice thin from thirst but steady. "That's more than anyone else." He looked down at the Apache man. The fever was high, skin hot, lips cracked, fingers twitching in broken rhythm. But he was alive, still breathing, and still holding on to something only he could see. "His tunic," Caleb said, noting the beadwork again. "That's warrior's work." Mara nodded faintly. "He said something on the way in. I couldn't catch it." Caleb moved closer, crouched beside the bench. His joints creaked, but he didn't mind. He leaned in just enough to hear the shallow mumble from the man's dry lips. 2 words, maybe 3, not English, but he recognized the tone. Mara was still. "He said something again, just before he passed out," she whispered. "I think it was about a daughter or a son." Caleb glanced at her, then back at the man. She was still crouched, back straight, hands folded now, waiting. She hadn't asked for food, or water, or rest. She hadn't even asked to stay. She had just stayed. Caleb reached for the tin mug on the side table, filled it with water, and handed it to her. She took it in both hands, slow, deliberate. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't spill a drop. She drank only half before stopping, then looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes weren't pleading. They weren't even tired. They were cautious and clear. He looked at the man again. Something inside him shifted. A line drifted up in his mind. A verse from years ago, from a page so thin it had nearly worn through from his thumb. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. He didn't speak it aloud. He just let it echo in his thoughts, like a breath caught between ribs. Then he looked back at Mara. "You can't stay here long," he said softly. She nodded once. "But I'm not letting him die out there in the dirt." She looked at him then, a long look. "I wasn't planning to leave." Caleb stood, slow and firm, and crossed to the door. He pulled it shut, this time with purpose. Outside, Dustwell had already forgotten. Inside, 2 strangers sat beside an old man they didn't know, and neither one moved to leave.
If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, please comment number 2. The old man moaned, sharp and sudden, as they settled him onto the long bench under the courthouse window. The sun had dropped beyond the ridgeline, casting the adobe walls in amber shadow. Dust hung motionless in the air, like time refusing to pass. Mara dipped a cloth into the basin and began to clean the wound. She didn't ask where the water came from. She didn't flinch when she peeled back the blood-crusted cloth. Caleb stood at the edge of the room, his back near the door, eyes watching without intrusion. His coat hung on a peg nearby, but he hadn't bothered to remove the badge pinned above his heart. It had stopped meaning anything long ago. "Still warm," she muttered. "That's good." Her hands moved steady, wringing, pressing, wrapping. She tore a strip from the bottom of her skirt with one motion and used it to bind the gauze. Her fingers trembled slightly, only once, when the man sucked in a breath and coughed blood into his beard. Caleb stepped forward, laid a hand on the man's chest, gently but firmly. "Breathe slow," he said, more to himself than anyone else.
"Stay with us." Mara paused, eyes flickering toward him. "You'd done this before," she said. Caleb didn't answer. He moved to the shelf and pulled down an old bottle of laudanum and a tarnished spoon. He poured carefully, then brought it over. The man drank with help, coughing again, but less violently. "He's lucky you were out there," Mara said, wiping his mouth. "No," Caleb said flatly. "He's lucky you were." They both fell silent again. Outside, footsteps echoed, but no one knocked, no one entered. The town had made its judgment already. Mara stood and poured another basin of water. Her knuckles were scraped. A welt bloomed along one cheek. Caleb noticed, but said nothing. He fetched a folded blanket from a drawer, wool, coarse, and sun-faded. He placed it over the man's chest with care. "You got someplace to be?" he asked, voice even. "No," she said, and nothing waiting. He nodded once, slowly. The room smelled of iodine, sweat, and something older, something like scorched wood and grief. "You can stay the night," he said. "That's all I'm saying for now." "I didn't ask," Mara said, not unkindly. She met his eyes then, steady and clear. "But thank you." She turned back to the basin and began to wash the cloth. Caleb returned to his chair and sat heavily. The old wooden frame creaked beneath him. He pulled the small leather-bound Bible from the drawer, its cover worn, spine cracked, and held it in his palm a moment before setting it down. The lamplight flickered. The elder Apache lay still now, breath shallow but even. Caleb watched Mara move in the dim room, folding linens, placing them on a shelf without being asked. Her steps were quiet, purposeful. It struck him, not pity, not even admiration, but a quiet recognition. She carried silence the way soldiers carried scars, close to the chest, never for show. As she bent to wring out the last cloth, he heard her whisper, almost too soft to be real. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted." She didn't finish the verse, but he did, in his head, without meaning to, "and saves those who are crushed in spirit." The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked and fell quiet. And in that small courthouse in Dustwell, 3 strangers shared the kind of silence that heals more than words. The knock came at sunrise. Caleb opened the courthouse door slowly, fingers grazing the grip of the pistol tucked into his belt, not out of fear, but habit. The early light cast long shadows across the yard, illuminating 2 figures standing still at the edge of the porch. A woman, older, gray in her hair but sharp in the eyes. And beside her, a girl no older than 15, face sunburned, hair in 2 uneven braids, holding a satchel nearly bigger than herself. The older woman spoke first. "We came for the one inside," she said. Her voice was dry as cedar bark. "The elder, he's ours." Caleb studied them both. The girl shifted her weight but said nothing. She looked down at her feet, then past him toward the half-open door. "He's still breathing," Caleb said. "Barely." The older woman nodded once. "That's enough." Caleb didn't move. "We ain't here to take nothing," she added. "We just need to be where he is." From behind him, Mara appeared, still barefoot, hair tied back with a strip of muslin. She didn't speak either, just stood beside Caleb, her presence alone enough. The older woman looked to her. "You're the one who stayed." Mara nodded once. The woman stepped forward. "My name's Naomi."
"This here's Ruth. She's mine by blood and by choice." Caleb opened the door wider, then stepped aside. "Don't make noise," he said. "He needs rest." Inside, the air was cooler, touched by the last of night. The girl moved toward the bench without a word and knelt beside the elder, her small hands reaching gently to check his pulse, touch his brow. Naomi stood just behind, eyes not on the man, but on Mara. "You saved him," she said, quiet. "No," Mara replied. "I just didn't walk away." Caleb closed the door behind them. A moment passed in the stillness. Then Naomi turned to him. "We'll work," she said, simply. "Help however you need." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything." Naomi's voice grew firmer. "It's not about owing, it's about surviving." He nodded toward the bench. "He kin to you?" "No," she said, "but he gave us food when we had none. Taught Ruth about roots, medicine, how to read wind." She looked at him evenly. "We stay, not for payment, not for kindness returned, just because that's how you live decent." Caleb rubbed his temple, felt the sting of old sunlight in his bones. "I don't take in strays," he muttered. Naomi's eyes didn't flinch. "We're not asking to be kept," she said. "We're offering to stand. That's different." Ruth glanced up from the bedside then, her voice like wind over cotton. "We don't need anything." Caleb looked to Mara. She didn't speak, but she nodded faintly. Finally, he pointed to the side room, old storage, empty except for crates and a half-broken chair. "There's space. It ain't much." Naomi smiled, barely. "It's more than we've had." They moved quietly, without thanks or fanfare. Naomi unpacked herbs and twine from her bundle. Ruth laid a small clay pot near the elder's side. Later that evening, Caleb found a single phrase etched into the edge of his old ledger, written in thin, careful script. "Not to be repaid, just to continue living." He didn't erase it. By the end of the third day, the whispers had made their way from the saloon to the general store, then to the pews of the empty church, like wind sliding through the ribs of an old barn. "They're still in there? 3 women now, ain't it? Someone said the judge is letting them sleep in the law house. Don't seem legal. Don't seem decent, neither." No one spoke those words to Caleb's face, but he felt them, carried in the way folks paused outside the courthouse gate, in the way old men nodded slower than usual or didn't nod at all. Inside, things moved differently. Mara scrubbed the stone floor until the stains faded, layer by layer. She found a broken broom behind the courthouse and tied its bristles tight again. Ruth swept each morning, silent, her bare feet careful not to stir the sleeping elder. She cleaned with the focus of someone taught to live unnoticed. Naomi boiled willow bark and dried yarrow in the windowsill. At night, she cut linen into bandages with a knife that had once been her husband's, back when there was still a husband to speak of. No one asked Caleb for anything. Still, he bought more flour than usual, left it on the bench without comment. On the 6th day, the elder opened his eyes. Just for a moment. Enough to meet Ruth's gaze. Enough for his cracked lips to murmur, "Daughter," in a voice so thin it might have been the wind. She wept quietly into her palms, then stood and made more tea. That same afternoon, Caleb came in carrying lumber, 6 planks, nails in a leather pouch. Mara looked up from her stitching. "What are you building?" He didn't answer at first. He stepped past the hallway where Naomi was laying fresh linen on the cot, past the back corner room, once storage, now theirs. He began hammering just outside the frame.
Ruth came to the doorway, arms folded. After the third strike of the hammer, she spoke. "You making a wall?" Caleb paused. "A door," he said, "for if you ever need one closed." Ruth didn't smile, but she nodded, once. That night, Naomi left a small tin cup beside his chair. Inside, mint leaves, boiled and dried. Good for the gut, she'd said earlier. She never said thank you, neither did he. But he drank it, and for the first time in months, he slept through the night. Outside, the people of Dustwell kept watching, but none of them came closer. Not yet. Evenings in Dustwell carried a stillness that wasn't peace, just the absence of trouble. But inside the courthouse, something softer had begun to settle. Not safety, not yet, but maybe the suggestion of it. That night, the elders' fever broke. Caleb found Mara folding linens beside the hearth. Her hands were careful, precise, like someone long accustomed to making order from chaos. He sat nearby, not too close. A lamp flickered between them. No words for a while, just the rhythm of cloth and fire. Then, slowly, she spoke. "My husband used to drink," she said. "Started with the winter he lost work. Ended the summer he lost himself." She kept folding. Her voice never cracked. "First it was words. Then it was hands. Then I stopped counting." Caleb watched the flame, not her. "Left when I saw what he could do to a door. Figured I'd be next." The linen in her lap stilled. "Funny thing is, I never thought of myself as brave. Just done." Caleb nodded slowly. "Done's a kind of courage." They sat quietly. Then it was his turn. "I buried a wife. And a boy." Mara looked at him, but didn't speak. "Fever," he said. 3 days apart. Spring of '76. No doctor close enough. No medicine fast enough." He swallowed once, like glass going down. "After that, I didn't talk to God for a long while." She didn't answer, didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they'd carried and hadn't said. A soft knock broke the stillness. Ruth stepped in, holding a child in her arms. His leg was wrapped, face pale. "A scalding," Naomi said behind her.
Fell against the stove. His mother's out of her mind. Caleb rose. "From town?" Naomi nodded. "They didn't knock here, just left it on the steps." Ruth laid the boy down gently. She had already mixed herbs, yarrow, comfrey, a bit of sage. Her fingers worked quickly. Mara dipped another cloth in cool water, pressed it to the boy's brow. "He'll keep the scar," Naomi said softly, "but he'll walk again." Caleb stood watching, his hand resting on the back of a chair, gripping tighter than he realized. The room smelled of lavender smoke and boiled leaf. Mara whispered something then, so quiet it was nearly a prayer or a memory. "Do not fear, for I am with you." Caleb turned. Her eyes were closed. Her hands moved over the child's wound, steady as if guided. "I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The verse lingered in the air, unspoken beyond that, but present, like breath before dawn. He didn't say anything, but he felt it. Not in the way of a sermon, in the way a hand finds yours in the dark. Outside, the wind stirred the dust, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like judgment, just weather. They came just after midday, 5 men and a reverend in a faded black coat standing in the street like a verdict waiting to be read. Caleb saw them through the window of the courthouse. He didn't move. Neither did Mara, who stood beside the shelf of dried herbs. Naomi and Ruth stayed inside the back room, silent but listening. The reverend stepped forward first. "Judge Whitaker," he called, loud enough for half the town to hear, "we'd like a word." Caleb opened the door and stood in the frame, arms crossed, gaze steady. "This ain't your courtroom," one of the men muttered. Caleb didn't blink.
You're standing on county property. That makes it exactly mine." The Reverend lifted a Bible, worn and marked. "You're harboring people who don't belong, women without husbands, an Apache fugitive. It sets a poor example." Caleb's jaw tightened. He's not a fugitive. He's sick. And the women are under my roof, which makes them under my protection. The tallest man spat near the edge of the porch. "This town's got away, Judge, and this ain't it." Another added, "You used to keep order." "I still do," Caleb said, voice like gravel.
"I just don't call cruelty order anymore." The Reverend stepped closer. "The good book says we must guard against the influence of the ungodly." Caleb stared at him. "So long as you remember the part about mercy." A silence followed. Then the Reverend's eyes narrowed. "People are talking, saying you've gone soft or lost." Caleb stepped down from the porch, boots hitting dirt. "People can say what they like, but they don't decide who gets left to die." The men left without another word, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Inside, Naomi sat stitching a torn shirt. Ruth fed the elder a spoonful of broth. No one asked what was said outside. No one needed to. That evening, a second child was left at the door, coughing, cheeks hot with fever. No name, no note, just a bundle of threadbare clothes and a whispered hope someone would open the door. Ruth took her in. No one came to fetch her. The next day, an older woman from the east edge of town appeared just before sundown. She didn't speak, just handed Mara a bundle of fabric, clean, folded, then turned and walked away. Later, someone left a sack of potatoes on the porch, then a bag of oats, then dried beans. No thanks, no explanation. But the courthouse felt a little less alone. That night, Caleb sat at his desk, ledger open, staring at the empty margins. He didn't write, didn't cross out names, just sat. When Mara placed a cup of tea beside him, he looked up briefly, then down again. His fingers traced the rim of the cup. Outside, the wind shifted. Not strong enough to shake dust from the street, but just enough to move the hanging sign above the courthouse door. It creaked once, then stilled. Naomi left before dawn. She didn't wake them. Just placed a wrapped parcel on the kitchen table. Dried mint, folded linens, and a single hair ribbon of Ruth's childhood. Caleb found it an hour later. There was no note, but the message was clear. She'd done her part. The rest was theirs to carry. Ruth didn't cry when she noticed. She stood a while in the doorway, then stepped outside, letting the wind touch her face. Inside, the courthouse was quieter than usual. The elder Apache still slept, but now his breathing had steadied. The fever had passed. A life spared by days of care and hands that never sought thanks. That afternoon, Caleb brought a small wooden box to the main room. He placed it on the table beside Mara, who was sewing a patch onto his coat, unasked, just something she did when her hands needed stillness. "I made something," he said, "a while ago, never gave it to anyone." She looked at the box, then at him. "You don't have to." "I know." He opened it. Inside, resting on soft cloth, was a ring. Silver, simple, no ornament. Polished flat on one edge, rough on the other, as if shaped from something once dangerous. Mara picked it up carefully. "Bullet casing?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "From a shot I didn't take." Silence wrapped around them again, not awkward, just honest. "I don't have music," he said quietly. "Good," she replied. "I never liked crowds." He pulled a paper from his coat pocket, 2 names written in black ink. No fanfare, no vows, just Caleb writing the date and Mara holding the pen when it was her turn. When Ruth came in and saw the paper on the table, she said nothing, just smiled faintly, then began boiling tea as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Later that evening, Mara stepped outside alone. The wind had picked up, stirring the branches of the cottonwood.
She stood by the wooden vacnan Caleb had built, once a wall, now a kind of door. She ran her fingers along the grain, then turned to find him watching from the porch. "You believe in second chances?" she asked softly. Caleb walked to stand beside her. "I believe in what we do with them." She nodded. Then he said it, not loud, not for anyone else, just enough for her to hear. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." He didn't need to say more. The wind died down just then. The sun touched the edge of the hills. And in the courthouse behind them, the last rays of light fell through a narrow window, across the floorboards, over the ledgers and laws that had once ruled that space. Now it belonged to something quieter, something chosen. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us. The first to arrive was the blacksmith. Then came the pastor's widow. By mid-morning there were 30. By noon, more than 70. They lined the street outside the courthouse, boots shifting in the reddish dirt, hats held low, eyes sharp with something between fear and memory.
Dustwell hadn't seen this many folks gathered since the last hanging, 3 winters ago, when the gallows still stood where the cottonwood now grew. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The silence carried judgment louder than any sermon. From inside the courthouse, Ruth peered through the curtain, her breath caught halfway to a prayer. Mara stood near the basin, wringing out a cloth already clean. Naomi, now sleeping after 3 nights tending the fevered elder, was unaware of the storm gathering outside. Caleb stood at the threshold. His coat hung loose. He hadn't reached for a gun. Just his worn Bible, spine cracked, pages curled like ash. He held it low in one hand. He opened the door. Wind slipped past him, lifting the corner of Mara's apron. A voice called from the crowd. "Enough is enough, Judge. You think we don't see what's going on in there? You gonna turn the courthouse into a heathen hostel?" Caleb stepped forward. Dust shifted beneath his boots. He didn't raise his voice.
"She gave water," he said, his eyes on the blacksmith, then the widow, then the boy who once stole tobacco from his desk and returned it with a note that read, "Sorry," when none of you did. The words dropped like stones into a dry well. Mara stepped out behind him, cloth still in hand. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. The wind caught her hair, streaked with ash and salt. No one moved. A baby cried in the crowd. Someone hushed it. And then, slowly, the blacksmith stepped back, not in retreat, but like a man who suddenly remembered the weight of his own silence. No one followed him, but no one stopped him either. Caleb didn't smile, didn't nod, just turned, stepped back inside, and closed the door. Not to shut the world out, but to hold something sacred in. Behind him, Mara dipped the cloth in fresh water, kneeling beside a child with heat behind her eyes. Outside, the crowd began to thin, not defeated, but unsure. And that, for the first time, was enough. He arrived on horseback, dust clinging to the hem of his duster like guilt he couldn't shake. Sheriff Councard wasn't a loud man. He didn't need to be. His badge had long done the talking, and in a town like Dustwell, where silence meant assent, that was enough. He tied his horse to the post, took off his hat, and stared up at the courthouse like it had grown teeth overnight. Then he knocked. 3 sharp raps, deliberate. Caleb opened the door. "Sheriff," he said. "Judge," came the reply. They stood like that for a moment, 2 men carved from the same old wood, splintered different ways. "You know why I'm here." "I reckon," Caleb said, "but I'd rather hear it from you." Cooncard nodded toward the courthouse behind him. "You've turned the People's Hall into something else. Folks are uneasy. They're saying you've gone and made it a sanctuary." "I made it useful," Caleb said flatly. "You made it a problem." There was no threat in his tone, just fatigue. Caleb stepped aside. "Come in, nothing hidden." The sheriff crossed the threshold slowly, eyes scanning every corner. Cot in the back, kettle on the stove, dried herbs hung neat. Ruth was teaching a boy to wrap a bandage. Naomi rested under a quilt, face pale but peaceful. Tahu, the old Apache, still lay asleep, one arm stretched toward the warmth of the fire.
Cooncard didn't speak. Caleb reached into a drawer, not for a weapon, but for a sheet of paper. He handed it over. "Marriage certificate, filed but unsigned. Thought I'd give you the honor of witnessing." The sheriff took the paper, his brow furrowed. "You think this fixes it?" "No," Caleb said, "but it names it, and sometimes that's where peace starts." Cooncard stared at the paper longer than he needed to. Then he pulled a pen from his vest, signed, passed it back. "You know this won't sit easy with them." "I'm not aiming for easy," Caleb said. "I'm aiming for right." The sheriff tipped his hat. "I'll let them know." He turned to go, then paused. "You're sure about this, Judge?" Caleb looked around the room, not at the people, but at the quiet between them. "Never been more." Cooncard mounted his horse. He didn't look back. Caleb folded the paper and set it beside the ledger, not for proof, just for peace. They waited until the sun dipped low enough to paint gold across the courtroom floor. No music, no ceremony, just 3 chairs, 1 table, and the silence of knowing this wasn't something to be celebrated, only honored. Ruth stood near the window, arms crossed, not in judgment, but in witness. Naomi, though far now, riding north with a trader's caravan, had sent a package the day before. A tin of salve, 2 silver buttons, and a piece of cloth embroidered with 3 vines intertwined. No letter, just the stitching. Caleb laid the paper flat on the table. The ink from the sheriff's signature was still fresh, a thin sheen catching light. Mara stared at it for a moment, then turned to Caleb. "Let's sign the door," she said. He frowned, confused. She walked to the wooden divider he had built weeks ago, simple pine slats, sanded but unpainted, a quiet line between her world and his. She touched the edge. "This is what matters," she said. "Not a paper for other people. This door, this choice." Caleb followed, a slow smile rising like dawn. He brought the ink and quill. Together they signed their names not on the certificate, but along the top slat of the door, hers above, his below. The strokes were uneven, his hand steadier, hers more delicate, but both bold. Ruth approached after a pause. She didn't say anything, just watched, then nodded once, solemn. Outside, the wind stirred. Not strong, just enough to shift the dust. Mara looked at her name. "I don't belong to any place," she said quietly. "Never did." Caleb answered without turning. "Then let this be the first place that belongs to you." She reached for his hand. Their fingers laced, not in passion, not in ceremony, but in something older, understanding, commitment. The door stood open. No vows spoken, no bells rung. Only names written where people crossed between solitude and safety. And from then on, every time Mara stepped through that threshold, she would pass by her own name, etched not in ownership, but in welcome. Outside, Dustwell carried on. But inside, something had taken root. The wood was different this time. Not from the courthouse stockpile, but a bundle he'd hauled in from an old mining camp 3 days out. Weathered, not heavy, redder than the pine he used before. The kind of wood that remembered storms. Caleb measured twice, cut once. The final panel fit into place with a hollow knock, more sound than needed in a room this quiet. But it echoed right, like a line finally drawn. Mara stood nearby, arms folded, not in defiance, but in thought.
"You don't have to build more walls," she said gently. Caleb wiped his hands, rough with sawdust and silence. "It's not a wall," he said. "It's a room." "For who?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "For you, for us." The words didn't hang, they settled. Mara stepped forward, touched the grain, still warm from his hands. There was no lock, no doorframe, just an open entry and a room behind it. A narrow cot, a low shelf, a small window that faced east. Morning light. That was all she ever asked. "People will talk," she whispered, not out of fear but habit. "They already do," he answered. "Let them get used to being wrong." She laughed then, soft, short, the kind of sound that only came after long stretches without laughter. She walked into the room, paused, then turned. "Do I get to keep it?" she asked, voice teasing but real beneath the smile. He nodded. "Only if you want it." "I do." Outside, the wind shifted westward. Inside, Ruth began humming a song, old, unrecognizable, but full of memory. Mara sat on the cot, not tired, just present. She looked out the window. No curtains, no bars, just light. "I never had a place that didn't want to change me," she said. Caleb leaned against the frame. "Then maybe this isn't a place," he said. "Maybe it's just space." She nodded. "I can live with that." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. Not as surrender, but as belonging. The rain began at dawn, soft, steady, like it didn't want to be noticed. It tapped against the roof in rhythms older than any clock. Dustwell didn't get much rain, and when it did, folks stayed quiet, like they owed the sky silence. Inside the courthouse, it was warm. A girl, maybe 7, sat wrapped in a wool blanket. Fever clung to her like a ghost refusing to leave. Her mother, eyes wide with fear but lips sealed, stood near the door, unsure if she'd made the right choice bringing the child here. Ruth knelt beside the cot, herbs steeping in a cracked teacup. Caleb stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. Not because he doubted Ruth, but because every moment like this rewrote something inside him. Mara entered quietly with dry towels and a jar of oil. She didn't ask the woman's name, didn't need to. Just knelt beside Ruth, placed a hand on the child's chest, then began humming, soft, slow, the same tune Ruth had sung days ago. Outside, no one gathered. No torches, no whispers, just rain. And yet the town knew. Word traveled faster than water. Another child cared for in the judge's hall. Another act of quiet defiance against what once was. Caleb stepped to the door. He didn't open it, just listened. No boots in the mud, no threats in the wind, only stillness. He looked at Mara. She looked up at him, then back at the girl. The fever broke before noon. The child smiled weakly, curled tighter in her blanket, and fell asleep. The mother cried, not loud, but with her whole body. Ruth placed a hand on her shoulder. Nothing else needed saying. Caleb sat beside Mara on the bench. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The wood beneath them was solid. The roof held. The room didn't echo anymore. It absorbed. And outside, the rain kept falling, not to wash things away, but maybe, just maybe, to help something grow. The frost came before the snow. It clung to the window panes, tracing silver veins through the glass, like old memories refusing to fade. Inside, the courthouse was quiet, more so than usual. Not empty, just still, like the world was holding its breath before saying goodbye. Tahu stood near the door. his back straighter than it had been in weeks, his walking stick carved now by Ruth's careful hands, with 3 notches, one for the day he arrived, one for the fever, and one for the day he chose to leave. Mara offered him a scarf. He accepted it without words, tucking it into his coat like something precious. Outside, the sky lightened, barely. The first snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air held the promise of it. Caleb came forward. "You sure you're strong enough?" he asked. Tahoe didn't answer right away. Then, "Strong enough to go home. Strong enough to call this place what it is." "What's that?" Tahoe turned, his face creased by 1,000 winters. He looked at both of them, Caleb with his weathered hands, Mara with her eyes full of flame and quiet. A place that stayed. He stepped outside. At the edge of the steps, Naomi waited. She hadn't said when she'd return. She never did. But she was there, reins in hand, horse ready. Beside her, Ruth held a small bundle of herbs and cloth, farewell gifts without farewells. Naomi turned to Mara. Their eyes met. She reached out, took Mara's hand in both of hers, and said, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." Ruth 1:16. Then she let go. Mara didn't cry, didn't need to. Some bonds outlive departure. Tahoe mounted slow. The horse didn't rush. The sun broke through, barely a sliver, but enough to gild the dust with gold. Caleb stepped beside Mara. No words, just the soft sound of boots in snowless frost. They watched until the riders became silhouettes, then smaller, then part of the horizon. Inside, the fire crackled. The room smelled of cedar, bread, and something older, belonging. Outside, winter had come. But for the first time in Dustwell, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like rest. If you found yourself drawn into this story, a like and a comment would mean a lot. Winter had claimed Dustwell at last. A fragile dusting of snow glazed the rooftops and drifted against window frames. Inside the courthouse, a hush lingered. Not the silence of fear, but of belonging. Ruth moved through the front door with a wicker basket in her arms. The porch light revealed 3 women trailing behind. A mother with her toddler, an older rancher with a scraped knee, and a farmer's wife carrying a sack of flour. "Miss Ruth?" Ruth smiled and lowered the basket. "I'll take that," said the mother, placing the sack beside Naomi's old medicine shelf. "No accusations, just thanks." Caleb sat near the hearth, hands wrapped around a steaming bowl of soup thick with root vegetables and hard bread crumbs. The heat lifted the fine steam. It carried the faint sweetness of thyme and rosemary. Mara joined him, her breath warmed by the fire. She'd taken off her dusty coat the moment she entered, smoothing a stray curl behind her ear. Between them, on the rough-hewn wooden table, sat a small pile of fresh bread. Baked earlier that morning by Mara, her first attempt with flour from the grain Naomi gave. The crust glowed golden in the lamplight. Caleb tore off a piece and offered it to Mara with a quiet nod. "No papers tonight," she whispered as she chewed, cheeks flushed. He placed the thumb of his left hand over the soft crumb. "I haven't looked at a case file this week." She glanced at the stack of ledgers on the shelf, once his lifeblood, and then at the loaf, then at his face. "You're happy?" He met her eyes. "For the first time in years," he said. "I don't know how it feels right yet." But his hands trembled less. Ruth cleared a chair beside them and set down her basket. "I've syringed honey into that boy's throat so many times the liquor store clerk asked what church I belonged to," she said softly, tilting her head to smile at Mara's loaves. There was no laugh track, just firelight dancing across eyes steady with tired joy. "They'll call this place a courthouse again," she added, "only now it means more than law." Caleb rested his stirrer and leaned forward. "A place built on mercy," he said. Mara folded her knitting, a scarf she was making for Ruth, wool she'd bought when the town finally accepted Naomi's herbal remedies. They sat in that room, judge, healer, and caretaker, each a pillar of something deeper than law: kindness, care, quiet persistence. Outside, the cold wind whined through the narrow gaps in the shutters. One of the boards groaned in protest. Caleb stood and slid a scrap of cloth, a remnant from Naomi, over the seam. He looked at Mara. "Not perfect," he said. "Perfect's overrated," she replied. Her words didn't need echo. They were enough. The fire died down to embers. Outside, snow whispered against the glass.
Inside, they finished the last of the soup. Ruth stood and collected empty dishes. "You two rest," she said, pulling the curtain closed behind her. Mara rubbed her hands together slowly. Caleb reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. He looked at the door that led to the room, the one they named the Room That Belongs. "If anyone came now," he said, voice low, "they'd see something different." Mara nodded, watched the firelight shift on the wall. "And maybe," she whispered, "that's enough." They held hands then. Not a promise, but a recognition. Not of grand victories, but of a peace earned in small acts. Ruth's footsteps closed behind the curtain. They were alone, save for fire, bread, and quiet. Snow began falling before midnight. It dusted the ledge of the single window, drifted along the sill. The flakes were large enough to see, slow enough to feel. Outside, Dustwell lay under a pale white hush. Inside the little room behind the divider, only a single oil lamp glowed. The chimney stoked a steady warmth, and the walls, once adobe gray, now held the promise of comfort. Mara stood by the small stove, gently stirring a pot of broth. Her left hand rested lightly on her belly, over the pup. She didn't look at Caleb as he leaned in the doorway. She didn't need to. He watched the rise and fall beneath her hand, sure, steady. Her hair had been brushed smooth, pinned back just enough. She wore a simple blue dress, hem just brushing her calves. She had hidden the rips from the beginning, and now the neckline was modest, mended. She looked whole, calm, alive. Caleb stepped forward. He didn't speak. He rinsed 2 cups and poured the broth with steady hands. The scent of herbs, sage, thyme, something soft like rose petals, rose warm into the air. It was the kind of smell he had almost forgotten. She took the cup, but didn't drink yet. He sat beside her at the narrow table that used to hold case files. Now those files had been cleared away. He ran his hand over the wood, smooth scars from years of paperwork. He said only, "It's real." She smiled, small, in the way that only begins to bloom. Outside, the wind pushed more snow. A flake drifted across the window, caught in the glow, suspended. Caleb watched it. Then, quietly, Mara whispered, "The light shines in the darkness." Caleb recognized the words. "And the darkness has not overcome it." John 1:5. They did not say more, not then. The lamp flickered. Her hand stayed where it was. Their fingers touched. No urgency, just the weight of presence. Ruth came in then, carrying blankets folded in strips of ribbon Naomi had left. She paused, noticing Mara's posture near the stove, and smiled as if she'd known all along. She hummed a tune, one that felt like sunrise over snow, bright and gentle. Behind her, in the entryway to the bigger room, a shadow moved briefly. It was Naomi's horse knocked at the door, still saddled, still waiting, though the rider was gone. The hush thickened. 3 generations of new life. The babe in Mara's belly, the medicine Ruth offered to the town, and the healing of a community admitting its shame and learning to care. Caleb lifted his cup. "To what we didn't know we needed," he said. Mara nodded.
Her hair caught the light. Her eyes glistened. No fireworks, no music, just that. His hand moved up to rest over hers on her stomach. Firm, comforting. Ruth knelt beside Marta and placed a soft shawl around her shoulders, chuckling as she adjusted the fabric.
"Ma'am, I think they've already started calling it home," she said. "I heard Mrs. Jennings calling the courthouse her favorite healer." Mara laughed softly, almost incredulous. Then she lifted her gaze to Caleb. They let the quiet sit between them. A world made from kindness and resolve. A future coming into form in darkness made bright by a single light. Outside, snow etched the window frame with rhymed vines of ice. The screen fades slowly. We see the courthouse under soft snow. Dust settling atop the roof, no footprints at the door, but one small trail to the back room. Inside, one lamp glows. A home built by mercy, a promise kept without words. And beneath the quiet sky of Dustwell, a new light grows. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with a quiet fire, a soft hand resting over new life, and the sound of snow falling on an old roof in a town that nearly forgot what kindness felt like. Maybe you've known a place like Dustwell. Maybe you've lived long enough to understand that the most powerful changes rarely come from grand speeches or angry mobs, but from a bowl of soup shared in silence, from standing your ground when no one else would, from choosing to stay when walking away seemed easier. Caleb's story is not just fiction, it's a reflection of so many untold truths from the true Wild West. Not the one of shootouts and outlaws, but of men and women like you, who loved deeply, lost deeply, and still chose to give, to heal, and to build something better with trembling hands. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone or a moment or a choice that shaped your life, then I invite you to stay a little longer. Like the snow on Dustwell's roof, may it settle gently in your heart. Subscribe for more true Wild West stories, where grit meets grace and faith finds a home.